So welcome to the Let's Talk Now podcast, episode 2. I'm joined by my good friend Klara.
Just said hello. Hello, everyone.
Klara's from the Czech Republic, and the Czech Republic, home of the famed Skoda Armaments Works. And Klara's no slouch herself. She's got a first in both her undergrad and masters, and she's also a figure skating champion as well, which she has told me that figure skating and ice skating are two different things. One is for amateurs like me, and the other ones are pros like her. So, welcome, Klara.
Thank you for the nice intro, Matt.
I thought you'd hate it, to be honest.
I'm glad to be joining your podcast.
Yeah, it's great. You know, I've had such titans as Ellis, shouts out Ellis, shouts out Georgia, and shouts out Holly, and you've joined the high ranks of that group of people. So, I don't know how good or bad that is for you, really.
It's a pleasure.
So, yeah, you know, Klara recently graduated with a master. With a master's, she got a first or distinction, however they define it. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
No, apparently you're not allowed to trot out your credentials, so other people have to do it for you. So you know themselves.
Yeah, thanks for that.
So should we go into the sort of our first question? So we've got a range of topics. Sorry, I'll discuss the topic. So we're going to be talking about Klara's dissertation, which is based around the kind of treatment and the kind of how the Jew, what happened to the Jews after World War II, if I'm correct in that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that could have been a big hurdle there. Dodge that one. We're going to be talking about the UN as well, sort of the UN's focus on kind of humanitarian actions, as well as any reforms we would make to the UN, specifically the UNSC. And we're going to be ending on talking about the Uyghur Muslims and how they've been treated in terms of by the Chinese government, how they've been discriminated against, and also how the international community and the Muslim community have failed the Uyghur Muslims in China. So a big range of topics today. Nothing mega positive, I guess, but you know, it's the way the world is at the moment, and we can't really change that. Unless, Klara, you're secretly Supergirl or something like that, are you?
Unfortunately, I'm not.
But yeah, so should we dig into the first question, which is, what was your dissertation about?
Yeah. So I named my dissertation "The Dispersal of Jewish Population from the Nazi Concentration Camps: International and National Responses and Individual Experiences." And the thesis is basically a historical analysis of the liberation of the Nazi camps and its aftermath, so including the life in displaced persons camps. And the primary aim of this thesis was to examine the international community's responses and the role of individual international bodies, so mainly United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and also the role of International Refugee Organization, as well as the involvement of the Jewish public sphere in the relief and rehabilitation efforts. And the final part of the thesis provides like a short comparative case study that analyzes Czechoslovak and British responses to the post-war DP crisis and their policies towards their respective Jewish minorities. And all the chapters were complemented by survivor testimonies and memoirs and their retrospective on particular issues, which, in my opinion, gives the thesis a realistic touch and kind of allows for a better understanding of the events from the human side of it. And I chose this topic because there's a vast amount of literature that has been written on Jewish life before and in the concentration camps, but there are not many sources that study the actual aftermath of the liberation of the camps and its objective and subjective impact on the released prisoners. So I was really interested in analyzing the various experiences of Jewish survivors and their reflection on the liberation and homecoming, which wasn't really as positive as one might think.
Alright, so that sounds very interesting. I've read part of your dissertation, I've not read all of it because Yeah, your boy don't read like that anymore. I've left the life of the educated reader behind once I left university. So there's that. So I'm not a nerd or a person who's well educated. So that's always good to know from your podcast host. So what was the most interesting thing you found out whilst researching for your dissertation?
This is a very difficult question because I found out several interesting things
Just
and facts during my research.
you can
But
talk about all of them if you want. You want to do top five or top three, whichever ones personal favorites. It's not a big deal.
yeah, okay. Well, I guess that what struck me the most was how limited the relief efforts were, and especially the military's perceptions of and attitude towards the survivors. Because one would think that these would all be, sympathetic and understanding towards the survivors' concerns and needs, but it was quite on the contrary. And nobody ever talks about this aspect of liberation, and hence, prior to my research, I hadn't imagined that any of the personnel would treat the Jews badly or hold onto the prejudices that the enemy, the Nazis, were spreading and embedding in people's minds prior and during the war. So, in the current context, presumably majority of people knows a thing or two about the Holocaust. So it is unimaginable and incomprehensible for us to understand why the Allies made some of the decisions and took the steps they did. For example, they didn't seclude the Jews from basically.
The occupiers and the people that they lived with previously, the sort of
Yes.
non-Jews,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
the people who may have
and...
the people who may have snitched them essentially.
Yeah,
people who may have been informants for whatever reason.
Exactly, yeah. So I remember I was outraged when reading some of the accounts of how the DP camps were handled, etc. But the more I researched and the more insight I was gaining, the more I started to understand. The Allies were not fully aware of all the horrors the survivors had gone through, and this is also true for the extent of the Holocaust. It was unknown to them, and therefore it took years before people were properly acquainted with all the aspects of the genocide. And it is true that many mistakes were made on the Allies' part along the way, which I'm not justifying. Nonetheless, one, I think, has to take into account all the aspects of the time. And the truth is, the situation in the immediate aftermath was chaotic. There were limited supplies, limited personnel, unexperienced personnel. People were rid of their humanity, unsure what is going to happen to them next. Why is not everything going back to normal more speedily, and so on? So it was really a huge task, and I dare to say that generally the Allies did all they could to the best of their knowledge and understanding of the time. And although the survivors' experiences were different in each individual zone of occupation, and everything really depended on the respective authorities. So the main point I'm trying to make here is that because we know so much about the history of the Holocaust nowadays, we sort of do not really realize how different it was back then, and that people did not possess the knowledge we do now. So I guess this aspect shapes our thinking of the genocide a lot, and we often forget to think outside of the box and still see the events with the present eyes instead of looking at this from the past perspective.
Do you think that the Allies genuinely did the best that they could, or do you think they, kind of were more focused on just winning the war, and kind of humanitarian efforts were kind of put on the back burner, if that makes sense? Or do you think they genuinely did try to help as many victims as possible?
So during the war, it was put back, and obviously the war effort was prioritized, and I'll get get to this in, I think, in one of the next questions in more detail. But I think in the aftermath, yes, they did put everything they could, because it was really difficult, and they had limited supplies. The Europe was wrecked, totally wrecked. There was no infrastructure, or destroyed infrastructure. They didn't have the people, they didn't have the staff to facilitate like medical care and stuff. So yeah, it was a very difficult situation, unprecedented. So I
Yeah.
think they tried to deal with it the best they could.
Okay, and I think that kind of links into the main kind of question I wanted to ask you, which is why weren't the Allies and the USSR more prepared to help prisoners during and post World War II? And so you did have sort of a part of your dissertation kind of dedicated to that, where you did talk about the Jews being put together with the people who may have collaborated, or at least kind of allowed it to happen, didn't stop this kind of thing of happening. Them being sort of isolating, the Jews being isolated in camps, etc. And kind of, I think you said that people were kind of organized based on nationality, rather than being victims and things like that. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Uh,
And yes, and this is very often criticized by the academics and historians, and I completely agree with all of them. But as I said earlier, this administration of the camps, it was done in this sort of way because it was the best solution they could think of at the time, I think. And they didn't realize they were putting them together with the people who were who slaughtered their families and friends and relatives. It just didn't occur to them. It was a gradual process of um, realizing those things and learning those things.
okay,
So
so
it was really unfortunate step on their part, but gradually and gradually they opted for segregation in the end.
given that there
Sorry.
was, it's fine. Given that there was one medical officer to every 650 patients, and a nursing sister for every 150 patients, do you think that the Allies gave as many medical professionals as they could, or do you think they kept many of them back to help within sort of their own nation states? Obviously the UK and France.
Yes, I think that many were kept back in the nation states, but then I can't really say for sure because I haven't, to be honest, I haven't looked into this particular issue uh, any any deeply. So, but yeah, my guess is they were kept back, and also um, they they didn't expect to find such a vast amount of people in horrible state. So then it would be really difficult for them to call on for reinforcements and to transport them into Europe.
Okay.
Also, adding to that, uh, I know that the military there were some military restrictions as well because they were trying to keep as many people out of Europe as possible until they knew for sure that the enemy was defeated and there was no danger for them. So this was particularly the case of, or in the case of Jewish relief organizations, they let them in late summer 1945.
Oh, and that makes a
Which
lot of
is,
sense. Yeah,
yeah,
because you don't want your medical professionals and sort of health groups being taken captive or being killed by the Nazis in this case. because that would make the situation way worse. So you want to secure the area first, which sounds very standard military practice. You talk about I think it's the next paragraph, where you talk about Western allies opting for segregation along the line of national lines, which is something we talked about earlier, and putting Jewish survivors with Nazi collaborators and anti-Semites, and then you kind of go on to talk about the misconceptions that the Allies kind of had. But from some of the stuff that I've read, obviously you're far more knowledgeable, especially in this regard, than I am. There were many Jews who warned the UK government about what was going on within Nazi Germany. So how much of a misconception could there have been if to an extent the UK governments and other governments were warned about what was going on within Nazi Germany?
Yeah, good question. There was a lot of misconception on the part of UK government, and for that matter, that was even true for other European governments. I think they weren't listening properly to the survivors and their concerns and needs, and this is even visible in the testimonies and memoirs of survivors. They would often go to the authorities and plead for a different system of housing, for example. But it took them a long time to actually take these pleas seriously. So they weren't willing to
kind of listen.
Listen.
So
yes.
And so I guess it kind of makes sense. Obviously, we're not saying that I could have done it better if I was in the 1940s, because I would have probably goofed as well, probably way worse. But I guess the point being is that had the authorities actually listened to Jewish people and other people who were fleeing at the time, then perhaps the humanitarian effort post the war would have been a lot more better and a lot more effective, especially when you look at kind of the horror show of the pictures and how kind of malnourished and how much people suffered, I think, under Nazi occupation. Perhaps then the humanitarian effort could have been a lot better. Would you kind of agree with that? Disagree?
I think I would disagree, because the governments knew prior to war. They knew about all the repressions that were going on in Nazi Germany against the Jews. Media were reporting it, and people were mostly aware that there was something dodgy going on, but nobody was willing to confront the obviously dangerous militant Germany that was on the rise at the time. Also, the Jews were only started being locked up after the Kristallnacht in 1938.
Kristallnacht, is that the night of broken glass?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
So, and it was not on such a scale as we know that was later on, in 1940s. So they wouldn't be able to prepare any better strategy in terms of humanitarian aid, because nothing, no genocide was occurring at the time.
Okay.
It was only at the later stage.
The final solution. Yeah.
Yes, and even then, I don't think they would believe. Really, they wouldn't take it seriously, because there were obviously messages and reports of gas chambers and stuff. But then the war happened, and it just they had other stuff on their minds. So
do you think they didn't want to believe it was happening? Do you think it could be a bit of sort of denialism, like, yeah, it's not, come on, man, it's not that bad?
Yeah, it could be. It wouldn't be uncommon. Yeah.
Okay.
That happened even among Jewish community,
I mean, yeah, I mean,
when they were.
oh, sorry, yeah.
Yes, sir. No, go on. That's okay.
So I mean, people still deny it nowadays. So like people are like, oh, it didn't happen, or things weren't that bad. So and we know a lot more now. Like you can physically visit the places that some of these things happened. I think in Berlin you can actually go to a concentration camp. Obviously, the Auschwitz, the death camp still exists. You can go and see it. So people still deny it to this day. So I guess it wouldn't be the hardest thing in the world to believe that some of these kind of world leaders didn't believe them, or didn't want to believe them.
Yes, yeah, I agree.
All right. So, is there anything you want to add to that, or?
I think just one thing. I think nobody could really imagine that something like this would happen. It was really horrible and really unimaginable. And even from the testimonies of the soldiers that liberated the camps, you can feel how disgusted and how unbelievable it was for them to find those people in such horrible conditions and such a horrible state. Just heaps of corpses everywhere. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that?
Something like this could happen. Yeah, yeah, 100% understand. So if we go on to, I think it's the next paragraph where it says Western allies, on the other hand, were to be stuck with the survival issue for years. Nevertheless, not all survivors had a place to return to. For example, German Jews and I think it says 20 Polish Jews gradually formed the largest part of the non-repatriable as their homes were destroyed, occupied, or they simply did not wish to return there because of their harrowing past, which makes a lot of sense. You wouldn't. You really might not want to go back to a place where you were abducted and you're lucky to be alive at this point. To be honest, and you talk about here where it says some of the people who returned were not welcome back and faced atrocious hate. What do you think of that? Imagine sort of going, being abducted by people. And being put in essentially concentration camps and death camps, and then once you are taken home, you still get a lot of that treatment. What kind of countries were doing that, and how do you feel about that?
This was definitely abhorrent deeds, and I can't understand how this could be happening, but people are hateful, and the propaganda was rampant, and just people had these prejudices built in them still pretty hard. So yeah, it must have been difficult times. So this was usually happening in Eastern Europe, and particularly in Poland, where anti-Semitism was very high. So people would return. They would want to go back to their home, to their house, and these houses would usually be already occupied by somebody else, who the Germans
Had assigned to that house, yeah.
kind of assigned to that. Yeah, exactly. And these people would mostly, they wouldn't want the Jews to come back. They didn't expect the Jews to come back. For that matter.
That is a phenomenal point, actually. That makes a lot of sense, because you could imagine, given how rampant the propaganda was, combined with a lot of pre-existing views about Jewish people, you could imagine a lot of shock, kind of saying that, could you imagine, like, if, you've returned home, someone else is living in your home, and they're like, you should be dead. You're, throw in anti-Semitic quotes here and there. And, that's a phenomenal point, actually. I didn't think of it like that. That's well put.
Yeah.
So we go further on. You've talked about here how kind of Jews were kind of relocated to the occupied areas of Germany, Austria, and Italy. So do you think that mainly Jews from Eastern Europe who were kind of moved into these sort of countries?
So that were either people who couldn't return home straight away after the liberation, and they stayed in the liberated camps for some time, because I don't know, they had typhus or they were treating some other disease, and then they were moved or stayed in the former concentration camps that were later on made into displaced people's camps. Or these people might have also been refugees from the east, so Jews who have already returned from the concentration camps. They returned home. They were rejected over there, faced pogroms and other violent attacks, and they decided they would come back because they had no other place to go. Or they were also Jews who were on the refuge from communism, so from the Soviet Union
as well. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense as well. You got to imagine they're running really from two groups of barbarians really. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Kind of, if we move on to our next question, because it still kind of links into this a bit, how do you assess the differences between how the Allies and Soviets dealt with the Jewish population post World War II? That was a question sent in by Georgia. That was, I think, it's a really interesting question because you do talk about it towards the end of that paragraph. So, what kind of differences did you see with the reaction from the Soviets and the Allies?
Yeah. So I think that the initial response of the Western Allies and the Soviets were more or less the same. So the primary goal was setting up field hospitals, kitchens, disinfection of the survivors, moving them from huts to the barracks to keep them warm and so on. Both sides also relied on the elder councils of the camps to provide information and help to restore order and participate in the functioning of the respective camps. So that were the primary issues and goals at hand. Then they also both collaborated with the international community of the Red Cross and local medical commissions. And especially in the first weeks in May, there was a typhus outbreak, so the camps were put on quarantine, and nobody was to leave the camps until they.
The typhoid was over. The illness was gone.
Yes.
Okay.
So the repatriation was kind of put on hold. Yes, but under what was different. So I'll start with the Soviet. Immediately after liberation, they were focusing on quick remedies. Yeah, so they would be nice to the people. They would provide chocolates, food from the military kitchen, etc. But at the time they liberated the first camp, there was still fighting going on, and so the survivors had to wait months before proper help came by. Some weeks or months. It really varied according to the location and situation over there. For the Soviets, there was really no space for national or ethnic sentiments because of their communist regime and propaganda. These completely buried the issue of the Holocaust. They twisted the Nazi repressions and remade the story of annihilation of Jews into enslavement of the working class to suit their regime propaganda.
Class reductionism. So sorry, they've just sort of said like, oh, the Nazis weren't after Jews; they were after the working class people.
Yes.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, they wouldn't mention the Jews at all.
Wow.
Yeah. So they completely disregarded the crystal clear Jewish factor of the genocide. And therefore, their management of the survivors differed extremely from that of the Western Allies. And this was all due to the particular communist regime. They also acted very quickly as to the repatriation of the survivors.
So is this after the war? Sorry, is this after the fighting was over? Or
Yes, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Repatriation could only happen after the fighting was over.
Okay,
Yeah,
so so they were very quick to repatriate people.
yeah.
That were okay.
hmm They wanted them out of the way as fast as possible because, firstly, they had other plans with the liberated Nazi camps because they remade them into and
Oh, POW, prisoners of war camps.
oh yeah, sorry, I misspelled that.
No, that's fine. That's fine. No, it's fine.
Yeah,
Don't worry about it. It's just the POV. I was like, wait, what?
yeah, POW.
Yeah,
Sorry,
don't worry. No, it's fine.
prisoners of war.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. So also those survivors whose place of origin was liberated and later subjugated by the Soviets automatically became Soviet citizens and were thus officially unable to emigrate. And so it happened very often that many families were unrighteously separated,
Okay.
and this, as one can expect, led these people to often engage in illegal activities like immigration.
Illegal immigration. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
I can't
but
imagine what that's like. Sorry. I can't imagine what that's like. You know, it's like, oh, you're a citizen of the Soviet Union. I was like, all right, great. It's like you can't go anywhere though. Like you're one of us. Like you can't leave. Like don't think
yeah, it
about going home.
must have been really horrible.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I can't imagine what that's like. You know, my family live in Italy. It's like, well, that's too bad because your new home is in Mother Russia or the Soviet Union. So I can't imagine what that must have been like. You know.
it must have been very difficult, especially for the families who were separated, and ended up in different camps.
Mm.
So I don't know. Um, let's say the mother and the child. The mother perished, and the child ended up in Mauthausen,
And where is
Austria,
that? Oh, Austria.
and the father ended up in Auschwitz or some subcamp of Auschwitz.
Okay.
And then they would be unable um, to meet because of the Soviet regime. If this family was originally, for example, from Poland.
I mean, in all honesty, they wouldn't probably know the other person's alive.
Yes,
I would
yeah,
imagine that there would be no way to actually know like how many of your relatives actually survived the war, which is crazy when you think about it like that.
yeah. The authorities and even the Jewish relief agencies, they ran a track and trace service, so they would be looking for relatives that survived. But yes, in many cases, it would take years, maybe even decades before people would be reunited. And especially, it was especially difficult with the children because they might have been very young. They wouldn't remember where they actually came from and who their parents were.
Hmm.
And in many instances, there were very few children who actually survived because they would be put in the first line for the final solution because they were deemed undesirable for obvious reasons
Yeah. I
as
could
well.
imagine. You know, they wouldn't be any good for what the Nazis actually used them for, which is slave labor. And so yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so yeah, if we talk more sort of about the Western kind of what the Allies did differently to the Soviets. So we talked about the Soviets, how they repatriate people, give them Soviet citizenship, so they couldn't actually move to maybe where their native country was. How did the Allies kind of differ to that?
So just to clarify, they would be able to move to their native country if that native country was, yeah, in either case they would be able to return. But if that particular country was later subjugated by the Soviets, like for example Poland was, they wouldn't be able to leave the country
Oh,
to
okay,
emigrate
that's my
to.
bad.
Yeah, no,
Okay,
that's okay.
okay.
Just thought I would clarify.
That's good. It's good clarification. So okay, so how did the Allies kind of differ from that?
Yes. So the Allies, um, they often stumbled upon the camps accidentally. So yes, they heard about the camps in the east, but they didn't expect there would be so many in the Western Europe as well. So they were totally unprepared for what they were about to discover. There were a heap of corpses, disorderly mob of people everywhere, disease and dirt, horrible conditions. So, in contrast to the Soviets, the Western administrations took a thorough care before sending the survivors home. It was crucial for them to rid them of the diseases before they could leave the camps. So they would cooperate with the Red Cross and local medical commissions to facilitate the healthcare. And they let relief organizations in, even though quite late, as I mentioned earlier. But they were not present in all the parts of the Soviet zones, these relief organizations. And if they were, they would be helping with the refuge to the west as well. Another point is that due to understaffing, the Western allies often had to utilize the help of German nurses who were anti-Semites, which was obviously uncomfortable and did not feel like for the survivors they were rid of them at all. So I haven't looked at any particular incidents in detail, but there definitely were some occasionally between the German nurses and the Jews, and I think this was another unfortunate step that the Western Allies had taken. But then, if you consider the bigger picture, you can see they didn't have enough medical personnel, so this was the best they could do.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
I think it is very important to know that both sides ultimately failed to alleviate the suffering of the Jews and recognize their special status, even though each side acted on different perceptions. And this is particularly when we consider that they didn't opt for segregation of Jews from the rest of the people they liberated, because it caused them great suffering. Some of those people were collaborators who helped to get their relatives or families murdered, and unfortunately, it took the Allies a long time before they were able to acknowledge this and act upon it, and finally segregate the Jews and acknowledge that they needed different care because of how differently they were treated by the Germans.
How long did it take? Sorry, how long did it take for the Allies to kind of understand their mistake?
It was months, and if not years. The UK was the last to acknowledge this, and they justified their policy towards this issue as that they did not want to perpetrate the Nazi thinking of Jewish segregation, but obviously,
that doesn't really make a lot of sense.
That's a weak justification.
So, yeah, I hope that wasn't Attlee that said it, but it might have been Clement Attlee that maybe said that. I'm not sure, but that is that's pretty bad. Not good. Have you got anything more you want to kind of add before we move on to our next topic?
Yes, that's it.
Okay, no, that's fine. We talk about post World War II. Obviously, the UN was created, and you've actually written an essay on that, which is something you can find on the website, which I'll link below. Sort of, how has the UN began to focus on humanitarian aid in war zones and natural disasters. So we've seen the UN obviously intervening in multiple different countries, helping refugees. The UN has a specific agency for that, and so the UN kind of doing a lot more than I think the League of Nations ever did when it came to humanitarian issues. The UN also intervening in the UK, giving children sort of more nutritious breakfast, which is crazy considering how rich the UK is. Also, the fact that the UN also wrote a report about the UK about poverty and things like that, and so the UN has moved into a much bigger organization, I think, than its predecessor. In that respect, and the UN does get involved in war zones. It has its own military, which enables it to do stuff. It does peacekeeping operations and things like that, and that kind of separates the UN a lot from its predecessor, the League of Nations, in that respect. So yeah, Klara, if you're ready, do you want to jump in?
Yes. So the United Nations was basically born out of the ashes of the Second World War. The world leaders wanted to establish an organization aiming to secure global peace and security, and what they have witnessed throughout the World War II and afterwards especially, they wanted to avoid this. And because they have seen what kind of horrible deeds can be done, they wanted to make sure that humanitarian and relief efforts were facilitated properly and in time. So there is an office that is responsible for coordinating UN's humanitarian aid. And this office is called the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It does so through its interagency standing committee, basically. And this interagency committee is comprised of members that include the UN system entities that are most responsible for providing emergency relief. And so if there is a humanitarian emergency, the OCHA draws funds from Central Emergency Response Fund in order to assist people that are affected by various crises, such as natural disasters or armed conflict, for that matter. It also operates through, as I said, it operates through a standing committee, and this is comprised of particular UN agencies that deal with humanitarian aid. So, for example, the United Nations Development Programme, or the UN Refugee Agency, formerly International Refugee Organization, or Children's Fund, UNICEF. So it really, each of those agencies focuses on a particular issue, so that they are more effective and efficient over their area of jurisdiction and expertise.
Do you think it's far more effective that the UN has its own departments to deal with this stuff rather than relying on nation states, where you've got the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, what a name that is, and sort of the UN having its own kind of ability to get involved, its own kind of medical expertise and things like that, rather than relying on nation states who may not want to get involved in certain scenarios, or are going to take time to scramble resources. Do you think it's a far better thing to have an organization that can deal with it?
Yes, I definitely agree with that, because we have witnessed on many occasions that nation states are not willing to put a hand in several issues and crises. So this is, in my opinion, far more effective and efficient way of organization.
Certain countries making cuts to the foreign aid, which is already very small. Wonder which country I'm talking about. So the UN helping refugees and children and the sick people and all the various things that the UN does. It's a far more effective than sort of its predecessor, the League of Nations, which my teacher used to pronounce the League of Nations, which used to make me laugh all the time. I don't know why. I can still remember him saying that in my head. What kind of segues on to our next question is, what kind of reforms would you make to the UN if you could?
I've got several in mind.
You've written an essay on this, and you can read that on the website.
Yeah, so the first one I would like to mention is enlargement. Nowadays, the UN consists of 193 members. However, if you look at the Security Council's membership, nothing has changed except, the replacement of the USSR by the Russian Federation in the 1990s. So the UNSC is often criticized for not being reflective of today's realities, which is understandable. There's been changed global order and power relations. The victorious World War II powers do not wield the same power and prestige today. And especially questioned is the UK's and French statuses, for instance.
Wow, how dare you, Klara? How dare you question the French? Okay, fine. You can question them all day. All right. How even the dog's been alarmed by this, Klara.
I'm being objective here, okay?
How dare you, Klara? We don't do objectivism in this country. Throw objectivism in the bin. Put that on a bus. Let's fund the NHS instead. That's what they'll say. But 100%, I kind of agree with your point. Sorry, I kind of cut you off there. 100%, I agree that perhaps it should have the EU as a group instead of having so many Western powers in, or so the UK, which isn't a military superpower anymore, or the French. They can go around bullying sort of African and Arab nations, but if it comes to a big, much stronger country, the UK's been like, no, I'm sitting this one up, bro.
So there's been quite a few proposals, and the debate on enlargement was particularly active in the 90s. And I think two models were proposed back then, out of which the 2+3 model, which presupposed Germany and Japan to become permanent members, and then one country from each continent would acquire access to the non-permanent group. And this probably had the best chance to succeed, because it was quite sensible proposal. Nevertheless, debates were eventually abandoned. And the reason for this was obviously the vast opposition from other countries, very often rooted in the regional rivalry. That is very often the case. I think on the other side, I think enlargement could also prove to impede the Council's efficiency. So currently, countries such as India, Brazil, or South Africa should be considered in the enlargement debates, as these have over time acquired great status in their respective regions.
These are BRIC countries as well, right? The sort of top developing countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
That's right. So that's for one. Secondly, if there still remains someone who's afraid of Germany and its power potential, then I think a single EU seat could be a plausible alternative to that. Although I doubt there is still somebody who's really afraid of Germany. And
depends who you ask, to be honest, Klara. I mean, the 1940s is over, but people still think we still live there. 100%. I think an EU seat would make far more sense, but I guess you'd still have debates over things. So yeah.
I think Yeah, sorry. I think if there was an EU seat, that firstly there could be no more talk of Western Europe's overrepresentation. Secondly, it would solve the problem of having too many members in the council. And thirdly, such initiative could eventually create a momentum to advance some structural reforms and would maybe put to shame countries which are blocking any reform, whilst encouraging other regional organizations to embrace the same path.
I think
But I acknowledge that it is uncertain whether this would be a plausible option even now after Brexit, because
here you
Britain
are
is.
again. You know, the foreigner taking a dig at us, man. I can't win out here, man.
Well,
What is
Britain
that?
is not.
I didn't bring you on this podcast to bash this country, Klara. How could you, man? I can't believe this.
No offense, really, but
You started the
Britain.
sentence with no offense, man. You've already offended me. You caused the offense. There's no takebacks. But no, I 100% again. You know, I keep cutting you off here. I know, but to make stupid jokes, but you know, we're not the power we once were. You know, the UK, and it was something we have to get to grips with. I think Brexit has kind of humbled the country a bit. Or it will humble the country, I think, to an extent. But yeah, do you think taking the UK out of the UNSC would be a smart move, or?
If it was just the UK, then no, no point really. It has to be more comprehensive reform.
Great, so we keep our seat by default. Big up, you know, that's what I'm talking about. Easy win. But yeah, no, 100%. I think if we kind of, yeah, the rotational members is a good idea, I think, but the fact is, I think the key problem with the UNSC, and I think it's something you would mention anyways, is the veto. I think the veto is the main problem with the UNSC. What do you think about that?
See the veto power as an anachronistic privilege that should be abandoned, really.
Should we explain the veto first? Basically, UNSC members can veto, I think it's any kind of UN actions. So if the UN want to sanction a country, if you're a member of the UNSC, you can say no. Right?
So it can only agree on resolutions when the P5 are in agreement.
P5?
Yeah, permanent 5.
Okay. Learn something new every day. So that does cause, we've seen that cause huge problems on an international level with a country like Syria. Although perhaps if the West had intervened in Syria, it could end up like Libya, which is looking a lot worse because there's no kind of exit strategy or kind of strategy to actually help these countries. It's all get rid of the leader and then we out. Good luck, guys. Perhaps it's a good thing in some ways, but you do see nation states kind of get away with a lot of things. I think the US has protected Israel with its power of the veto consistently over the last, I think, 15 years. I can honestly say during the Obama era and the Trump era, Israel has been mostly protected from UNSC resolutions. I don't know how much you agree with that, Klara.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. I think that matters of national sovereignty, they always resurface and often outrank collective interests. And the veto power is too often used for narrow national reasons. And I think that decisions made under this mandate lack credibility.
What reforms would you make then? If I said, look, I'll give you a couple of reforms, I'll give you the magic wand, you can make a few changes. What kind of reforms would you be looking at?
Well, I would abolish the right to veto.
So how would the UNSC make decisions? Would it be based on the majority of members then?
Well, from the top of my mind, I would say yes.
So would you abolish the UNSC altogether, the Security Council, and just say it's up to the UN as individual members like countries should decide on things rather than having just 5 permanent members having the power to decide things? Do you think that would be a much better system?
No, because there is too many members in the General Assembly. It would be hard to agree.
What if you just went for a narrow majority, just said as long as 51% agree, or just over 50% agree, then that there's a resolution right there.
I don't have a magical solution to that really, but I think there should be there there should be official debate on this topic among the state officials and academics to try and develop some sort of a proposal to this issue, because I think preserving the right to veto, it was meant to ensure and deliver greater efficiency, but that idea has obviously failed to materialize. And there is so many issues over which the council has been in deadlock. So it really appears undesirable from the moral point of view of the UN to preserve the right to veto, because it actually prevents the UN Security Council from enforcing measures to end violence, as it happened, for example, in 1971, when the USSR vetoed a resolution which demanded a ceasefire in Kashmir.
Damn, you got examples.
Yeah, so this is solely my personal view, but I think there might be other viable alternatives that are obscured to me.
Yep.
In terms of abolishing the veto, but I believe that until the veto system is abolished, the UNSC will remain an arena of power and realpolitik, and it will remain a mere reflection of its members, and cannot just be expected to remedy every situation equally effectively, or at all, for that matter. So I am all in for some sort of official forum of academics and politicians to sort of establish a couple of proposals on the reform of the Security Council and their decision making, because the veto power just doesn't do it for me.
I would hope to see you in those forums debating someone, which would be quite funny. I would change the veto. I would make it so you need two members of the UNSC, and say maybe 2 permanent members and 1 temporary member to veto, if that makes sense. So I would change it from one a permanent member to maybe 3, or say 2 plus 1, and I would probably change it to, if it involves your country, you cannot veto it. It would be up to the other member states. Maybe that would cause more problems. Like, the US, you got to stop locking kids in cages. The US being like, we're going to veto that. Like, actually, you can't because it involves your country. And the US being like, dang.
I think that would be. I think they could just bring lobbying in. It would, like, if it was a resolution that the US would like to veto, something related to Israel, let's say.
Yeah.
And it couldn't veto the resolution, they would just ask another country to veto it.
Yeah, they'd probably try and grab us, because the US loves bringing the UK down, and probably like some other third country like India's like, yo, India, you're going to veto this, and we'll send you some, or we won't punish you over the way you've treated Muslim people. Or if there was like a resolution, say, against China for the way they've treated the Uighur Muslims, perhaps China would probably have to do the same thing. Be like, yo, India, I know we recently fought, but we're buds. We both hate Muslims, so maybe we can come to an agreement here. 100%, I agree with what you're saying. Is there anything you want to add, or?
With regards to the veto power, I'm all done. Okay. But I've got a couple of other suggestions.
All right, shoot. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So another point I would like to make is that there is no mechanism to prevent unilateral action. So it is closely linked to the veto power, basically. And the UN Security Council is unable to prevent unilateral actions of one of its members, as it happened in the case of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. And Saddam Hussein even counted on the division in the council and anticipated its paralyzing effect.
Yes, I remember. Yeah, I remember reading this actually. Maybe we read the same article on it, which was that no one expected the US and the UK to take unilateral action like that, or I guess it'd be multi because there's two of us. And so Saddam was like, "Yeah, you can't do anything because you're deadlocked in the UNSC."
Yeah, and
then,
he carried on defying UN resolutions.
Yes. And then, because he was always playing coy over whether he had nukes or not, he was like, "Maybe I do, maybe I don't. There's nothing you can do about it." And the US is like, "All right, cool. Hold my AK. I'm about to jump into your country." And then, boom, Saddam got taken out. Sorry, I interrupted you again. Just if you want to carry on your point.
That's all right. Yeah, but so he carried on defying UN resolutions. But he didn't expect a unilateral invasion by the US. And there is another still relevant example, and that is the Palestine issue, which cannot be addressed consistently due to the strong alliance between Israel and the US, who, according to the data from 2019, I know it's a bit old, they voted 44 times against such resolutions on behalf of Israel. So, unfortunately, the absence of democratic principles and practice continues to infringe upon the UNSC's legitimacy and credibility, and therefore hindering the overall image of the organization. So, definitely, this should be addressed. So, and the last reform I'd like to suggest concerns UN's military forces. So, in my opinion, if the UNSC is expected to address crises effectively, it also needs its own standing forces. But in the current state of affairs, it continues to be dependent on its member states to provide their military forces when required. Expectedly, modern states that have a technologically developed military at their disposal tend to be reluctant to contribute more in violent crises, which is the implication of the financial costs it bears.
I think.
And again, the national question resurfaces as the respective governments of these states then must justify to their domestic constituencies why it is essential for them to contribute and provide their resources. So, in my opinion, creating a permanent military answering directly to the UN would contribute to greater effectiveness when responding to conflict, as it would allow faster deployment of forces. Yeah. So,
sorry.
On a concluding note, the scope and power of the UN Security Council are constrained by structural weaknesses in the whole of the UN system, which to a great extent relies on outdated framework and practice, and this is furthermore impeded by the impact of national politics. And although the UN as a whole remains the only legitimate global body in the eyes of the majority of the people, I think it should continue to put more effort into gradual reform to persuade the critics about its credibility and that its legitimacy is not artificially constructed and maintained by the once great powers who refuse to give up their privileges.
Sorry.
Yes.
No, it's fine. No, have you got anything more you want to add? Because my points are probably not going to be as important as yours. Is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, maybe just that for all its flaws, I think the UNSC has successfully served as a platform for regular and sustained contact to discuss strategies and conflict management between countries. So, in the sense, it has made a great impact and has, without a doubt, succeeded in preventing another global conflict, even though this scourge war as such could not have been eliminated, as the UNSC just does not hold a mandate of a global policeman. Nonetheless, it should be more reflective of today's realities, and there really are reforms, some reforms that are much needed. And I think if the UNSC is to be, or if the veto power is to be retained, then there needs to be some sort of a reciprocity mechanism employed that would observe its usage and penalize pertinent abuse of that power. Otherwise, I think the institution loses its credibility, and that eventually leads to a loss of legitimacy. And I think that would surely mean utter disaster. And that's not just for the people that rely on the assistance of the UN, but also for all humanity, as it would inevitably dash all hopes for a functional international society. So until the current system is reformed, I think the UNSC cannot be fully expected to do more than reflect the tendencies of those it represents.
Okay.
The Permanent Five very often needs to put the UN aspirations ahead of their national interests if it is expected to be effective in dealing with the issues that it faces. And I hope this will come into reality one day.
Well, I wouldn't wait up or hold your breath on that one, Klara, because I can't see that happening. A couple of points I wanted to add, probably more stupid points, in fairness. I think as much as we want the UN to reform, given the fact that the veto ability is so strong, I can't imagine that the UN, the UNSC would want to give up, the permanent members would want to give up the powers that they have. Also, I doubt you've seen this, but there's a Dave Chappelle skit where he says that someone tries to tell him off or something like that, and he's like, "Have you got a military?" He's like, "No." He's like, "Well, you better back up, and then you better keep going. You better keep backing up. You ain't got no military." I think that's pretty good. I think it's pretty relevant. He's also got another one where he says modern problems require modern solutions, which I found really funny as well. And so I think that's the third point I was going to make, but I can't remember what it doesn't matter anyways. Stupid points. But yeah, 100% I agree. I think the UN, the UNSC does need massive, reformation. I think you've put some good points across. And so we'll see in the future, because you can only be deadlocked for so long until some idiot takes unilateral action. Looking at you, George W. Bush. So yeah, who knows at this point. So yeah, I think we're good on that point. The reforms you'd make to the UN, right, Klara?
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Sorry, it's like dead silence there because it's like a noise gate on this app as well. So there's like a slight audio delay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, it's not you. It's the app. But yeah, it's good. It's good. No, I like Discord. So if we go to our next question where we talk about the way the Uyghur Muslims have been discriminated, and there is a lot of other topics we could have talked about when it comes to human rights violations. We could have talked about the Saudis in Yemen. We could have talked about the Palestinians in Palestine or occupied areas of Palestine by Israel. We could have talked about kids in cages by America. There are so many things. Sort of the failure of kind of what's happened in Syria right now and Libya. With the way people have been treated in those countries, there are so many incidents we could talk about. But I feel like talking about the Uyghur Muslims is so important because there's a lot of people who are reluctant to talk about the Uyghur Muslims because China will essentially erase you for talking about these things, whether that's online where they can censor your name. They did that with I don't know if you've heard of this story, but there's a footballer Mesut Ozil where he talked about what's going on with the Uyghur Muslims, and they erased him from all their the Chinese censored internet. They took him out, and it's just sad state of affairs really. And so talking about the way that the Uyghur Muslims have been discriminated against, I think is such a important topic, purely because this is something that people seem reluctant to talk about. How much do you kind of agree with that, Klara, or disagree?
Yes, I definitely do agree, and It unfortunately reminds me uh, the 40s and 1930s
Yeah.
when people were reluctant to talk about what's going on with the Jews in Germany and Eastern Europe. So it's very unpleasant, and I hope it will change very soon. And yeah, this issue should definitely be addressed, but politics is a
Messy
tough
at
game.
best. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not something you want to be involved in. So if we just run through the articles, the ones that we've both looked at. You've got things like child separation from families. You've got a teacher talking about the forced sterilization within Xinjiang. You've got the goal of sort of the Chinese embassy in the US saying that a study shows that in the process of eradicating extremism in the minds of Uyghur women in Xinjiang, women were emancipated and gender equality and reproductive health were promoted, making them no longer baby making machines. They are more confident and independent. The goal of the Chinese embassy using essentially feminism to kind of push their agenda of forced sterilization, family separation, and slavery is just absolutely barbaric, and why Twitter haven't done more to deal with the Chinese embassy account is embarrassing, to be honest. If we just let me run through a few more of these, and then we'll talk about it a bit more. China forcing birth control on Uyghurs to suppress population. We've got here China uses tourism to smother Xinjiang's culture, where this article they talk about how China essentially turned Muslim holy sites or sort of to mosques and things like that within certain regions to sort of get rid of them. Essentially, people stop going there as much. It's a very interesting article to read from The Economist. This also talks about the kind of erasure of Muslim history within China as well. We've got Huawei, having a patent in order to some sort of AI technology so they could identify Uyghur Muslims by characteristics. Very, very Nazi Germany. Kind of when they talk about Jews having big noses and other kind of facial features. This looks like something Huawei are participating in when it comes to Uyghur Muslims. We've got deadly fear attack. Oh, don't worry about that. You've got Xinjiang, which is something we're going to be talking about a lot more when it comes to cotton, suggesting that more than 500,000 people are being forced to pick cotton in Xinjiang. We've got M&S, talking about a call to action over the forced labour over cotton. We've got the Daily Mail. I'm not going to blame the Daily Mail for this, but they gave the NHS masks linked to Chinese Uyghur factories, which is, I'm not going to blame the Daily Mail for this, but to say that this is how susceptible businesses are when they do business with China when it comes to manufactured goods. Also talking, talk about the amount of kind of concentration camps there are. Phenomenal work from BuzzFeed. We've got Apple's long-time supplier being accused of using forced labor in China. We've got here, this is something we'll talk about actually in a few minutes, sort of the deal that they made with the EU when we talk about the international community, but kind of, seeing all these things, Klara, sort of forced family separation, I can't even speak now, separation, sterilization of women within, Xinjiang and certain other areas. We've got forced labor, erasure of history. What kind of, how do you, what, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this now. What do you think about all of this stuff happening within China?
It is.
If you
I
do you want to
think
talk
for
about it one
me,
by one? Sorry, do you want to
for
go through
me,
this
it
one by one?
is. Yeah, we will definitely go through it one by one.
So, if we talk about the family separation and the forced sterilization of women, what do you think about that?
It is horrible, and for me, unbelievable that something like this is actually happening in the 21st century. Like I wouldn't expect anything this barbaric to be going on in such a developed society. I'm beyond words, and I feel with the victims and with the Uyghur population. It's horrible, and I would like to see some action on the part of the international community to be taken with regards to Uyghur repressions.
And so, sorry.
I think that especially when it comes to child separation and institutionalization of the children by the Chinese government, it looks like they are denying children their basic rights and cultural heritage as well, because they are taught in Chinese. They are forced to sing and dance to propagandistic songs, and it's basic manipulation of the children's minds. And it is, I think this is the worst sort of attack on the Uyghur culture they could have made. They're trying to erase any sort of Uyghur thinking and legacy, I would say.
Yeah, 100%. Stopping them from carrying on having children and things like that, and erasing their history is a surefire method of erasing ethnic cleansing a group of people, essentially. Locking them away in concentration camps and things like that, and forced labor camps. This is something we'll be talking about in a few minutes, but kind of the wider sanctions on China over the cotton being picked there. But according to this article, the Guardian one, the Xinjiang region produces more than 20% of the world's cotton, being produced essentially by slave labor. It's just madness, that it's that this sort of thing is happening on a global scale, and how despite anyone's best efforts, it's very hard to kind of be an ethical consumer within the world we live in, because the clothes that you could be wearing could be in part made by slave labor. Most likely it was made in a sweatshop, but also at the same time the cotton itself being picked by slaves, it hits differently.
I agree.
And Apple products being made there, and other products, so many other products and things being made within China. There's no guarantee that it wasn't made by slaves, and that's the kind of heart-wrenching thing, that why haven't companies done more to move manufacturing outside of China? It's just unreal when you know what's going on over there.
I agree. I think it is irresponsible on the company's part to not examine their supply chains properly. I think this is something that should be prevented. Or,
I mean, you've got a company here in Apple. I think it's $1 trillion company, right? Making their screens within from slave labor. Your company is worth so much money. You do not need to do this. You can afford to pay people properly, and this is the decision that you guys have made. And you haven't done anything about this.
This is capitalism, my friend.
Yeah, you'd have to tell me. This is the worst end of capitalism as well. But yeah, that's the kind of reality of the world we live in. If you look at the BuzzFeed article, there's so many camps within northern areas of China and central China. It's just unreal, and people actively deny this. People are like, this isn't happening. China like, well, no, we treat these people well. There's no such thing. We don't have slave labor. It's like, no, you do, pal. You do. It's just unreal, the amount of information control and what they've done to people. And the UN can't really do anything about this, as we mentioned before, because of the ability to veto any kind of sanctions against China. And any time any country kind of talks about what China are doing, China can actively cut business ties with them. And the US criticizes China, and China are like, well, look at your country. You had an insurrection recently. You've had protests over the way black people are treated by police in your country. I think you should sit outside. And it does kind of show you that countries really do need to keep a clean house here, because that's all countries like China will do. They'll just criticize you, despite the fact that China is one of the worst human rights offenders in the world right now. Probably joined up there with the Saudis, to be honest. What do you kind of think about that before we move on to the next kind of question?
I definitely agree with that. And well, we all know that China is basically a police state, but what they have been doing to Uyghurs, it's completely disproportionate how they've been treated by the government.
I mean, this is sorry, Clara. This is kind of erasing. This is ethnic cleansing at a very high level here. Getting these people into labor camps, stopping them from having children, erasing their history. What we are witnessing here is, something short of the Nazis' final solution, where they gas people. But this is that on a much slower scale, and it's very scary to think how far the Chinese government have gone to deal with an ethnic minority within their country.
What you're saying is completely right. I would just like to point out that one has to take into account that China has a very sort of strange idea of meddling into what they call internal affairs. Yeah.
That's what they call it. Yeah, they're like, this is our country. Let us deal with things as we see fit. And it's just, if we follow that policy worldwide, it's gonna just create massive problems. And there is a time where you should be sanctioning other countries, and I think the time is now. The time has to actually deal with sanctions on China. I don't know if there's any more you want to talk about when it comes to kind of businesses and China, and kind of the discrimination that the Uyghur people faced before we talk about the international community.
Mentioned the main ones already.
All right. Do you think it's time to move on and talk about the international community then?
Yes.
Okay. So the international community, China have recently agreed a massive investment deal with the EU. China had promised to ban forced labor, but China also denies that there's any forced labor, and they also deny there are Uyghur camps. So that's to put it lightly, that's as good as the Munich Agreement. To be honest, it's probably worth less than the Munich Agreement. To be honest, because China are just denying that any of this happened. So how are the EU going to prove it? The answer is they're not. What do you think about that?
I think this is a very contentious deal. I think that the EU should have insisted on ending forced labor in China before they agreed to the agreement, because right now it just seems like they just wanted to make it look like they pushed China to take some action in regards to Uyghur repressions, but in reality this is actually not what happened. It's it's all about the wording when it comes to international conventions and agreements and deals, and the condition was that they would promise to ratify international convention on banning forced labor, but the promise is not the actual deed. So
yeah, I mean, you never believe a politician's promise. It's the one thing. If there's anything they teach you in politics classes, when a politician says something, don't believe it until you see something happen. Don't believe what they say. Look at the voting record. Look at their actions. That's basic politics. And the EU making this deal is incredibly naive. I have special kind of condemnation for Germany for doing this, for agreeing to this deal as well. A very, very egregious thing to do, especially given the kind of narrative of we never forget the past. Well, I think you've forgotten pretty quickly, Germany. To be honest, the international community not doing a lot here. Where's the article gone? 30 nations. At the UN, 39 nations condemn China's abuses of the Uyghur Muslims, but unless something happens from this, unless we see sanctions or we see boycotts and things like that, this doesn't really achieve anything. This is saying, China, President Xi, you bad man, you've done some things wrong, you need to fix up. And President Xi saying, well, are you gonna do something? And the world community is like, nah, bro, keep the goods coming. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's nothing really happening from this. What do you think about that?
Yes, I agree. And this is again a politics game. Um, well, everybody is trying to get their chunk of meat, and
Yeah,
this is
pound of
all
flesh. Yeah.
what yeah, this is all what this is about.
Um,
Um,
so yeah, yeah, 100%. I agree. You know, it's incredibly embarrassing that the UN, especially with the countries involved within the UN, talk about humanitarianism and things like that, and then you kind of agree an investment deal with a country that has dealt with a minority group in one of the worst ways possible. Like I said, I think the only group probably worse is the Saudis in this respect. And if we move on to kind of a next bit of this question, where you've seen kind of the UK take a stance against this. Surprisingly, Ian Duncan Smith
mhm.
leading a charge on this, and I'm thinking, Ian Duncan Smith, really? It's Ian Duncan Smith doing this. Ian Duncan Smith, really? Like, the man's one of the dumbest people in the Tory party. And it's not the leader of the opposition. It's not the Lib Dems or the Scots or anyone like that. It's Ian Duncan Smith. Like, come on, man. And so, leading kind of a charge on this, you see, people coming through the courts in the UK trying to get some sort of ruling. Dominic Raab, saying that we're going to put sanctions on companies doing business with China that, where, the products come through slave labor, specifically the cotton that comes from the Uyghur camps. You've got the US also imposing sanctions and cotton import restrictions on suppliers controlled by the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps. So you've got individual kind of nation states, kind of putting up sanctions and, talking about condemning countries and the Conservative government looking for a reset with China. But realistically, what does this kind of stuff achieve?
That is questionable because I think unless there is a coordinated policy and approach or stance taken against Chinese repression of Uyghurs, I don't think it will have that great of an effect on the Chinese government.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Like, okay, fair enough. You're going to limit imports and sanction, some of the people involved with this. I mean, they're living in China. Like, what are you going to do? Close their British bank account? Like, no, they live in China. Like, they have a Chinese bank account. You're going to do minimal. You're going to do basically nothing to any of these people if you follow this strategy of, dealing with the kind of people involved within this without dealing with the politicians involved. And sanctioning, Chinese cotton is a decent move, I guess. If I was going to give some credit, at least you're doing something. But on a whole, what does it actually achieve? What do you get out of doing this? It's just not much. It's barely a slap on the wrist for China.
It's taking a moral standpoint, and actually, it might encourage other countries to join this effort, and eventually, they might create some sort of coalition. But it is all very uncertain.
Because honestly, I could say if we had stayed a part of the EU, if the UK had stayed a part of the EU, we could have vetoed this trade deal, and then we could have actually condemned China, but we didn't, and we've lost so much clout in the world and so much ability to actually do something with regards to countries like China. But at the same time, if we actually really cared about human rights, we would have done more before we had left. But that's a separate conversation for a separate time, I guess. But what we can kind of gather, I don't know how much you agree or disagree with this, is the international community have done very little to help the Uyghur Muslims within China. I don't know how much you agree. I know it's a loaded question, but kind of, where do you agree with that statement, or do you think I'm being a bit harsh?
No, I definitely agree. I think many countries are afraid to confront China on this matter because China has become an important partner for them in terms of trade and investment. So that's the main issue I can see behind this.
I mean, the Chinese government, Xi Jinping specifically, have been very intelligent in the way they've sort of sowed, soft power within, the globe. Things like the Brick and Road program, where it's massive investment into countries to create, infrastructure from China to the Western world. You've also got, them rivaling the IMF and the World Bank in terms of giving financial support to developing countries, with them instead of giving out high interest loans. What they've done is just take resources in exchange for infrastructure work. I remember seeing a documentary in first year where they talked about how how much China is investing in certain African countries. So it's very interesting in that respect. In the way China have gone about it, rather than using hard power, they've used soft power, which is far stronger in a lot of ways. Because by sanctioning China, you're in part sanctioning yourself and your own ability to trade and make money. I think that's kind of one of the points you were going towards, Klara.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, by sanctioning us, you sanction yourself. Should be give them that one for free. I think that's a good enough one to talk about. And I think if we go to kind of the second half of the question, talk about the embarrassing kind of responses from the Muslim community. When especially when the Muslim community talk about being one body, one people. A lot of Muslim countries have been incredibly quiet when it comes to what China have done. Mm-hmm. I saw far more outrage over President Macron's comments about radical Islam than we did over what China have done to Uyghur Muslims, with a boycott over, French products. And sort of not just, a government saying we should boycott these products, people actively boycotting French products over comments. Erdogan, I think, said Macron's mentally deficient or something like that, or saying, implying he's got some sort of mental problems. Erdogan talking about rising Islamophobia in Europe, but he's been very quiet on China, Pakistan as well, Saudi Arabia, the home of Islam, causing a genocide in Yemen, so they're not ready to speak. They're going to try and keep their heads low whilst they're genociding a group of Muslim people. So yeah, Iran being very quiet as well, another Muslim country, an ally of China. So the only thing more embarrassing, I would argue, than the international response to what China have done to the Uyghur people is the Muslim community's response to what China have done to the Uyghur people. I know obviously you're not Muslim, and it's a bit different, I guess, you commenting on this, but in some ways. But I don't know how much you agree or kind of disagree, or if you've seen things to the contrary of Muslim countries actually standing up against China. What do you kind of think about that?
No, I'm afraid I definitely agree with you, and even though that's in the current state of affairs, there has been sort of a change of this trend whereby the Organization of Islamic Cooperation tended to support China despite its repression of Uyghur Muslims. Like nowadays, fewer members of the organization now support Xinjiang policies and condemned its actions multiple times at the UN. But I think it is questionable to what extent this is actually a mere rhetoric in an attempt not to look like biased hypocrites.
It's true.
I definitely agree with you. They have not been doing enough, and it pains me to say this, but they act like so devoted to Islam and act so pious when it comes to the case of Macron and the affair that happened with the history teacher, but then they are silent when it comes to actual oppression of fellow Muslims in China. So
100%. I agree with that. The actual, when that French cartoon company that always causes problems by releasing cartoons that annoy people, which is kind of what they do. I can't remember their name, but you see far more outrage over things like that than you do over actual human beings being killed and enslaved by a nation state. And it's embarrassing that the Muslim community always reacts like this. Maybe if China released cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, then maybe you would see some action over this. But given the fact that it's just human beings who are being enslaved here, no one seems to care. And 100%, I agree with the point you just made there. It is sad, isn't it? Where the international community has failed them, the Muslim community has failed them, and really, I don't know where this ends, because I can't imagine any kind of global war where they go into China to deal with what they've done. That would end horribly with a lot of problems with with nuclear weapons. I think there was one thing I think you said earlier about the UN kind of helping with peacekeeping. I think the point I was meant to make was that I think it's just nuclear weapons that have done that with countries fearing nuclear mutually assured destruction. I think that one of the key reasons why no one's going to go to bat for the Uyghur Muslims is no one wants that scenario, which is the worst case scenario, and many countries don't want to lose money. Over sanctioning China. We've seen what a trade war with China has done to the US US farmers. They were decimated. They stood no chance in that trade war, and unless it's literally the vast majority of the world that sanctions China, I don't think anything will happen with regards to helping the Uyghur Muslims. Because I think President Xi is going to be in charge for a long time, and I can't imagine him changing strategy overnight or in the next few years. China obviously fear the Uyghur Muslims for whatever reason, because they're a large minority within China and fear some sort of uprising. So instead we're going to imprison them and enslave them and humiliate them, which in all honesty is probably more likely to cause some sort of uprising within China and more problems within China. But it's just me. I'm not. I'm just some guy. I don't know how much you agree or disagree with that statement, but it's just a horrible situation for everyone involved, to be honest.
Yes, you're right, and sadly I have to disagree, and especially those coercive birth control practices that the government has put into place. This, in my opinion, indicates ethnic cleansing at minimum, if not signs of genocide.
Yeah, and sorry,
I don't see it ending very well for the Uighur Muslims, because if the international community doesn't change its stance very soon.
I mean, all UK and the US have done is put some sanctions on China, which is very small sanctions in all honesty when it comes to things like cotton, which again it's not something I disagree with them doing, but it's just not enough. And the UK kind of falling out of international prominence, something we've talked about kind of throughout this podcast. It's just what kind of influence does the UK have in the world? Not much, especially compared to a juggernaut like China, which has put in place massive amounts of soft power with many nation states, even Muslim nation states as well, which is ironic given all that they've done. I can't see the situation changing much, which saddens me a lot, to be honest.
I agree.
And I don't know what more we can kind of talk about on this topic, except the only thing we could do is literally hope something changes, and that's about it. I don't know how much you kind of disagree with that, Klara, but it's a kind of sad way to kind of end this podcast, I guess.
Yeah, it will be ending on a rather negative note, but yeah, I agree. All we have to do now is hope, and maybe we should all try and help in some sort of a way, if it is advocacy, campaigning, and boycotting Chinese products. Any way is useful at this point. Hopefully our governments will eventually follow, even though I really can't see it happening.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe email your elected officials and ask them. Why haven't your elected officials done more to talk about this? I'm tempted. Maybe I'll email the Labour Party and ask them why is it Ian Duncan Smith and Dominic Raab leading the charge on this? Why haven't you guys spoken about this? Where are you guys on this? I can't hear you. I don't see you anywhere. But yeah, I don't know. I think this is a good place to end the podcast. Email your local officials, talk to them, and see why haven't they done more to speak out against the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in China? Also, you could ask them why they haven't spoken out more about the genocide in Yemen or any other humanitarian kind of disasters that are happening right now, and a lack of intervention from other countries. But I think this is a good place to end it, Klara, if you're okay with that, unless there's anything more you want to add.
Definitely agree.
So yeah, just to wrap up, we've talked about Klara's dissertation. We've talked about the the way Jews were treated post World War II by the Allies and by the USSR. We've talked about the UN and kind of changes we'd make to the UN. And we've also talked about the way the Uyghur Muslims have been treated. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed the podcast. It's gone on a bit longer than I would have hoped, but I haven't got a problem with that, given that I think it's the vast majority was substantive, apart from the bits where I made bad jokes and references that most people probably wouldn't get. Klara, you've been a brilliant guest, and I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. You can read one of Klara's essays on the website, and hopefully I'll be able to put more up there in due time. There's also a piece from Georgia about modernization of financial theories or something like that. I need to reread it again to fully understand it, but yeah. What are your thoughts about coming on the podcast, Klara, and how are you feeling now?
I'm feeling slightly nervous before recording the podcast because, well, as you know, I'm an introvert, so I don't really do this sort of stuff.
People didn't know that. You didn't say that at the start. No one did.
Well, okay, as you know, as you mentioned or know, I am an introvert.
Just 2 minutes, man.
Yeah, but I have to say I kind of enjoyed it, and thank you for having me.
You spoke a lot more than I thought you would, which is good, I guess, which is great. Because I think I've learnt a lot more than I thought I would, if that makes sense. It's been great having you on. I think that I'm hoping that whoever listens to this will learn a lot from this podcast, because I think that we've covered a lot of issues which maybe some people don't really talk about as much.
True. Yeah, I agree.
So yeah, I'm going to end it there. That's episode 2 of the Let's Not Talk Now podcast. Klara has been our guest. Before we end it, can you explain to people how to pronounce your second name?
It's fairly easy. So it's you pronounce it as Balkova.
Okay, that's not too bad. I've never heard you say your second name, so I was a bit nervous. I should have really introduced you with your full name. It doesn't matter.
That's alright.
Anyways, I think it's a good place to leave it. Thank you for coming onto the podcast. Hopefully we'll see more of you in the future.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Alright, that's episode 2 over. I'll see you guys next time.